Sticking with the House floor passed a resolution today that proposes the establishment of a new task force that could change the direction of a growing green energy industry here in Louisiana. House Resolution 64 calls for the creation of the Clean Hydrogen Task Force. The task force would study the growing hydrogen industry in the states, ranging from production to usage and storage. The study would also look into possible ways to accelerate production of green hydrogen, as well as incentivize the use of hydrogen in future projects. After conducting the study, the force would be required to develop a plan with the recommendations by no later than the 1st of December. The plan would then have to be sent to the governor and legislative body for deliberation. State Representative Tony Romero, the author of the bill, says the resolution will help keep Louisiana its lead in the growing industry.
The problem is that as the market grows, other states will grow with it, and this is a task force to maintain Louisiana in that dominant position.
This resolution is not the first of its kind, though, when it comes to the state's push for hydrogen production. Back in 2022, Louisiana formed a coalition with both Arkansas and Oklahoma called the Halo Hydrogen Hub. It's partnership between these three states in order to develop the interstate hydrogen network that would eventually be integrated into the national framework, something that is projected to lower costs and increase adoption of hydrogen as an energy source. HCR 64 passed unanimously in the House with 88 votes in support. It is now awaiting introduction into the Senate.